good afternoon, and good evening, students, teachers, and the generally curious. Welcome to another episode of the Constitution in American Life with us, the Friends of Publius. My name is Chris Kavanaugh, coming to you from the northern plains of Bismarck, North Dakota. The other members of the band are Tim Moore, Deputy Director at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Tim is coming to us from Waukesha, Wisconsin, known as the Shaw, home to one Lester William Polsfuss, better known to us as Les Paul. We have Professor J. Michael Williams from the University of San Diego at the always sunny San Diego, where in addition to his teaching, he's trying to get his twin sons to take over the sports and entertainment worlds. And we have our resident bus driver, provocateur, Dave Richmond, coming to us from the jewel of California Central Valley, Bakersfield, where Dave splits his time between coming up with his always probing questions for our program and training to join the senior golf tour. And as he shared with us earlier, he shot a 75 today, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, almost shot his age. So very good. I have the opening for tonight's segment as I was yanking Dave's chain there. No, Dave's a pretty good golfer. The opening segment, I was hemming and hawing on what words of wisdom to share. And I'm afraid this may sound like several of our openings lately, but I was listening to our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, explain the justification for the United States attack on a boat in international waters this week, claiming that it was carrying drugs into the United States. The craft appeared to be destroyed and 11 people were killed in the strike, according to what the administration has reported. So I was thinking about presidential power, which is pretty much our segment for this evening, and I asked my AI assistant to compare and contrast two very important cases dealing with this topic. The cases are Ex parte Milligan, decided in 1866, and Trump versus the United States, handed down in 2024. In Milligan, the court had to decide if the Civil War created a situation that allowed the president to try civilians in military tribunals. And in the more modern ruling, the court had to decide if a former president can be held criminally liable for his actions while in office. Here's what my AI assistant scrubbed from the web. First, with Ex parte Milligan. Context, it arose during the American Civil War, a period marked by Presidential Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus and the use of military tribunals to try even civilians, even in states where civilian courts were functioning. Lambda Milligan, a civilian from my home state of Indiana, was a member of a group, I think they called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Sounds familiar. And he was charged with inciting and aiding the Confederacy. And he was tried in a military tribunal and not a civilian court. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that trying citizens by military commissions is unconstitutional. It's a violation of the guarantee of trial by jury applied in times of war and peace, and that neither the president nor Congress can authorize military tribunals over civilians if civilian courts are available. Very significant in this case is that it's a foundational case emphasizing the supremacy of civil courts over military authority in areas where civilian courts are functional, even during wartime or national emergencies. It affirmed the enduring nature of constitutional rights and limitations on governmental power, even in times of national crisis. Trump v. U.S. 2024, the case involved the criminal prosecution of former President Donald Trump for his alleged actions related to January 6, 2021 Capitol attack and his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. Trump claimed presidential immunity from prosecution for his actions during his time in office. The facts of the case are federal grand jury indicted former President Trump on 4 counts related to the January 6 events, including conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruction of an official proceeding. Trump moved to dismiss the indictment, arguing he was immune from prosecution for actions taken while in office. And the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 ruling, held that former presidents are absolutely immune from criminal prosecution for actions within their core constitutional powers and are entitled to at least the presumptive immunity for other official acts. However, the court also ruled there is no immunity for unofficial acts. The court remanded the case to the lower courts to determine which of Trump's actions were official or unofficial. The significance of this case is first time in the Supreme Court directly addressed the question of a former president's immunity from criminal prosecution. The decision sparked debate about the balance of power between the branches of government, the scope of presidential authority, and the accountability of presidents under the law. Critics argue the decision creates a law-free zone for presidents and weakens the rule of law. There are similarities. Both cases dealt with fundamental question of limits on governmental power and the protection of constitutional rights. Both cases also involve challenge to executive actions taken in time of perceived crisis or significant national events, Civil War versus post election challenges. The differences: the focus on Ex parte Milligan centered on the rights of civilians during wartime and the limits of military authority over them. Trump v. US focused on the immunity of former president from criminal prosecution for actions taken while in office. I'm going to add a little bit more to the um, context because many people do not realize this. Um, this uh, Justice Davis, who issued the opinion in Ex parte Milligan, actually was a friend of Lincoln's. And he actually served as Lincoln's campaign manager for his second trip to the White House. And so he was put on the court, probably part of the spoil system. But he is the one that handed down the ruling in 1866. Now, they heard the case not quite a year to the day that Lincoln was assassinated, and they ruled in a matter of weeks. And I'm going to try and find this really quickly. My notes are kind of messed up here, so bear with me here. Uh, yes, I just want to share this quote from Justice Davis from Ex parte Milligan, because I think it's very powerful. And he's dealing with, obviously, the habeas corpus. So this is a quote from the decision. This nation, as experience has proved, cannot always remain at peace and has no right to expect that it will always have wise and humane rulers sincerely attached to the principles of the Constitution. Wicked men, ambitious of power, with hatred of liberty and contempt of law, may fill the place once occupied by Washington and Lincoln. And if this right is conceded and the calamities of war again befall us, the dangers to human liberty are frightful to contemplate. If our fathers had failed to provide for just such a contingency, they would have been false to the trust reposed to them. Anyway, we are in weird times, ladies and gentlemen. The expansion of executive power, dealing what we're going to deal with this evening. And I kept going back to these words from Justice Davis in this opinion and thinking about how the court has dealt with the crisis during the Civil War, which is, I can't imagine a larger crisis in our nation's history, and the crises that we may be facing today. All right, back to the regular programming. I have an event from today, gentlemen, and I need your input, your wisdom, and I know how you're going to answer this, so I'm not going to go to the needs to know, nice to know, nuts to know, because this is an event that happened today. It's the anniversary, but I would like for you to maybe explain why you think this, because I'm going to venture a guess that you guys are all going to go needs to know, so I need a little clarification from you. Today is the anniversary of Governor Orville Faubus calling out the National Guard, stopping 9 African American students from enrolling at Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock. I'm going to again guess that you guys think this is a needs to know. If you disagree, please, you can disagree. But why is this a needs to know? And Professor Williams, we'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a good one, Chris. I'm going to steal like some of Tim's thunder that he's been talking about this year. So sorry, Tim. I think it's a need to know because to me, it's like a example of grassroots activism and grassroots kind of courage. So, the fact that the students were willing to sort of take that chance and to do that, and then to do it repeatedly afterwards in other places, I just think if you're thinking about individuals that you want to sort of emulate, that you think are courageous, then I think that you have to look to that event.
Thank you. Mr. Richmond, Professor Richmond.
Oh yeah, clearly a need to know. I think I would identify it because it's a post-World War II modern action of interposition by a state official against federal law, in which that state official interposes themselves between the law and its application in their own state. And it also, and the question was, what is the national government going to do now that Faubus does this, and we know that Eisenhower and the crisis at Little Rock and things. So I think for the constitutional of how this thing plays out, going back to that 19th century notion of interposition, nullification, this was an action of that in the post World War II period.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, Yeah, Mike did steal my thunder, but I'll say some similar things, and maybe a little bit, add a little bit. I think, as I've said before, really do prefer thinking about what regular citizens do. And so the fact that these kids, these are teenagers, are facing, getting their heads caved in every day. And once they got in the building, it wasn't over either. I mean, I think Ernest Green once said it was the longest year of his life, and he went all year to Little Rock Central. So it has it all. That event has the constitutional piece, it has the federalism piece, it's got bottom up activism, it's a profile in courage. My gosh. So I think I saw a teacher a couple years ago. He taught the whole civil rights movement within the Little Rock Seven or the Little Rock Nine, because so many of recurring themes in the civil rights movement are found within the Little Rock events in '57. So I think it's absolutely needs to know, and it has the bottom up and the top down if you like top down history too. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, just a little side note, the very famous photograph of Elizabeth Eckford with the young girl behind her with her face screaming at her, twisted in fate and hate towards her, was who, and Elizabeth Eckford was somewhat singled out from the group. She did not make
Yeah.
it to school that day. That photograph was taken by one of my former professors, Will Counts, who was a professor, photography professor at Indiana University. Will has gone on to the great dark room in the sky, but he took that photograph as a young stringer reporter covering the events of Little Rock. So it was pretty cool to hear his memories of covering that as a newsman at the time. So, bus driver, you're the man.
All right, thank you, Professor Kavanaugh. Well, ladies and gentlemen, since we last saw each other, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce announced their engagement. The Los Angeles Dodgers and San Diego Padres are doing everything they can to not make the playoffs. And the U.S. government attempted to deport 600 Guatemalan children under the cloak of darkness and the violation of due process of law. Another fun-filled and fascinating week in Trump's America. In today's episode, we are going to be addressing a topic from Unit 3 of the We the People State Questions, asking students to discuss unitary power of the executive orders, and the power of executive rescission. So at the core of this theory of the unitary of this topic is the unitary theory of executive, which has now become the dominant view of America's constitutional arrangement, at least for those who are in power at the national level. For 35 years, I taught that autocracy was the natural state of man. This view was developed after reading Plato, Machiavelli, Hobbes, as well as perusing studies in social psychology and human evolutionary history. So let's begin our discussion with a broad kind of view. Broad. Mike Professor Williams likes broad views here. And we will start that with, again, this unique person. Professor Williams is one of the most unique people I know because you don't find a lot of people who are both a Raiders fan and a Giants fan in America. And so I acknowledge his uniqueness by liking the color black and felons as fans who attend those games there. So, Professor Williams, let's get in it. Before we get into the nuts and bolts, I would like to start with, again, maybe theoretical, philosophical question. I have a couple of them. One, I'm wondering, do you agree with me that our natural inclination is towards autocracy, thus explaining why democracies have relatively short shelf lives? And secondly, do you agree that this truism about our nature explains the language in Article 2 about executive power, i.e., the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America? So, whatever order you want to go in, but if you could kind of give us your insights to those two questions.
Yeah, these are good questions. I'm going to spend a little more time on the first one because the second one I think we're going to be getting to. I'll address both, but natural inclination.
We want a daddy.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because that's going to feed into what I'm about to say. I think that well, first of all, students, you should know that to Dave's point, for most of human history, we have had non-democratic governments. So the experiment with democracy is relatively short in our history. Um, and I do think that, I guess I would say, authoritarian impulses, both by leaders and by people willing to accept authoritarianism, can be activated, and it can be activated under certain contexts. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So I think there's a persuasive argument there. Here's my pushback is that when I started thinking about this question, I thought, okay, I'm with Aristotle, I'm with the biologists and the evolutionary biologists and the psychologists who say we are social animals, and that what have gotten human beings to the top of the food chain has not been living in a Hobbesian world, but it's been our ability to collaborate, to cooperate, to somehow form trust. So that inclination to me pushes away from a natural inclination to authoritarianism. So I think that it's something that can be taught one way or the other. I do think that as human beings, threat or perceived threats will make us in our social groupings look for the strongest person among us, stronger, whether mind or body, to then keep us safe. I do also think that there is something maybe within us as human beings that we seek out autonomy and we seek out self-control of our own lives, which to me leans towards democracy. So I think it's a bit of a balance. But there are two works that we'll put in the show notes. Don't laugh, they'll be in the show notes. There are two things I've read over the course of my career that I think, and I wonder if y'all have read this. One of it's an author. His name's George Lakoff, who's a linguist who had wrote this book on moral politics, and then he wrote this book on how to talk to elephants. So he's talking about the way Republicans and Democrats talk about politics. And to your point, Dave, in his first book, he talks about how Republicans he uses the metaphor of family. And he said Republicans have a strict father model. They want hierarchy, they want rules followed, and they are going to be more likely to be maybe a little more, authoritarian is a strong word there, but a little more strict. Democrats, for the most part, are what he calls a nurturing parent model. So it's much more of free range kind of childhood, much more sort of much more compromise. And his argument that feeds into what work by Jonathan Haidt, another book I'm going to put in, this is Haidt's work before he did Anxious Generation, is that your childhood can create and your culture can create certain moral universes for you to kind of swim around in. And that some of us swim around in more authoritarian type universes, and some of us maybe in more and less authoritarian type universes. And according to Haidt, that has very much become partisan and polarized now. So my argument is, I guess, whether it is natural. I don't know if it's natural. I think there are seeds of both. I really think it can be taught, just like we see with Stanley Milligram's experiment, right, over obedience. I think that there are certain contexts where these tendencies can come out. I'm not on board to say that it's just a natural, full human inclination to be authoritarian, because I think there's too many counterexamples to that happening, if not at a big scale, at a small scale. So that's
Well,
my answer to the first question.
and I think it's well done. I'm just wondering if these things can be taught.
Yeah.
All right. And so if democratic values and democratic institutions can be taught, then how do you explain the slide by democracy throughout history into autocracy?
Yeah. I would say
The failure of civic education?
no, well, we could get into that. Look, can I turn, this is not fair because that was a great question. I think if your argument is like super persuasive, the question should be, how did we ever get democracy to come out of authoritarian regimes?
Yeah.
So I think it's a good one. I think students, look, right now it's 20% of the world's population that's living under democracy. The high point, according to Freedom House now, Freedom House says 46% of the world was living under democracy in in 2005. There is a slide. And David's point, I think, is this slide is just we're coming back to our base instincts, right? And my argument would be if it was that strong of a pull, how did we ever get out of that base instinct to even experiment with democracy beginning in the 1700s up and through? I mean, the high point was really 20 years ago. That was, and then now we've had a slide. So, yeah. So I think the failure of civic education, yes. I think culture matters, childhood matters, but culture matters. And part of culture is media and social media. And I think that has something to do as well with these attitudes. And the final thing is the literature says charismatic leaders matter. I mean, you get a charismatic leader who has authoritarian tendencies. And there's work out there that was done after World War II by this guy Ardono, who looked at like what makes authoritarian personalities more more likely, because he was curious about what happened in places like Germany and Soviet Union. I think those are factors that just kind of play into it. And I think right now we have maybe a perfect storm of real crisis is happening, perceptions of crises, demographic changing where segments of the population feel threatened, charismatic leader, a culture where we're all on our own echo chambers. And I think all that has kind of come together. Sorry, that took too long to get through that, but
No,
yes.
it did not, Tim.
Yeah, I can't help but think I appreciate Mike's framing of certain ways of speaking, use of language in how you configure reality. I think I can't help but think that a person's view of human nature may influence their optimism about the possibility of democracy. Um, if people are good or malleable, perfectible, versus a person who sees the human nature as fatally flawed, they may be more have a tendency towards a Hobbes. And here's where Chris chimes in with the great Hobbes quote: "The fear of death at the what is it? Hands of another."
The fear of violent death,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
just death, violent death.
yeah. So I think the view of human nature may influence our either optimism about democracy or what others would say, no, the reality is we're flawed people and we need a strong hand. So I think human nature does play into that.
I'm going to channel my inner Rousseau and Carl Jung in the idea that it's not human nature, but our existence in society. Rousseau. That's what Rousseau. I'm pretty sure he thought that human nature was in our natural state was good, but then we go into society, all these other factors that Michael was alluding to, it has a corrupting influence. And Jung, his belief that we're all a product of all the events that have led up to our very point in this life where we are right now. And so if you're in a household that is leaning one way versus a household that's leaning another way, or your experiences are one way versus another way, then you're going to lean that way. And that's kind of helps makes us who we are, I think. I mean, Jung was a pretty smart dude in terms of psychoanalysis. And I don't know about Rousseau. He was pretty smart, but he pushed a lot of buttons, that's for sure. But I tend to, and I kind of tend to agree with David that we do lean towards authoritarianism, but we do, as Mike said, we do work our way out of it. But I go back to what I said before in a previous program. I think it's all on that pendulum, right? Things happen. We get that perfect storm, all the ingredients that Michael just listed, and we push towards authoritarianism. And once people have power, they're reluctant to give it up. But then enough people push back, and whether it's through violence or through whatever means, people realize that the pendulum has swung too far. And students do not forget that Nazi Germany, with the rise of Adolf Hitler, the most famous or infamous authoritarian in history, one of in history books, came to power through a democratically controlled government. So, I mean, it happens. It certainly happens.
And Mike, I know you kind of wanted, but the second part about my contention that this truism about what I see as nature, or however you want to describe it, explains the language of Article 2, and pretty much all executive power shall be invested in a president.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm going to defer highly to the E3 on this, but I think the debates over the executive power kind of show how the framers were trying to get this balance. I mean, the articles were maybe like not enough. but then there were people at the convention saying we have to be very careful. We do not want another king, right? I see the language that I know we're going to get into, this language of a president. To me, that is just solving the big debate over whether it's going to be a plural presidency or a single presidency. That's how I see that. Um, I think they were trying to get that just right. And I do think the framers maybe overestimated the power of design. I think I maybe overestimated the power of design to our ability to sort of control it, to control maybe these inclinations. One of the things that comes out of both Lakoff's book and Hate's book is that they say these moral universes or this language or this way you're brought up, they say it has nothing to do with reason. And that's why it's so hard to have these debates. They say it's very emotive. It's like you feel a certain way about authority or you feel a certain way about a parenting model. So it's hard to like reason your way out of it, which I think pushes towards your argument, David, that like if our whole system is based on the Enlightenment principles of reason, and really we're living in a romanticism kind of world where we're just all touchy feely with like being human. Yeah, maybe Article 2 was set up. Maybe the flaws of Article 2 is because we cannot reason or design our way out of these flaws.
Or the fact they just simply underestimated human nature. That could be an issue too, and because I think Madison even said about the vesting clause, which the whole idea of a unitary executive, that when their argument at the founding period was, yeah, are we going to have multiple executives or one? And so we get the idea we need a single executive for the arguments that Hamilton puts forth in the Federalist Papers. So in Madison's like, yeah, so we're one executive, and he has executive power. And the idea of a unitary executive really starts taking hold in the 1980s. It's really when it starts to. That's really when it starts to come up in the Reagan administration. So,
Well, I think Mike and Chris have partly addressed there, Professor Moore. In a very timely column in the last couple of weeks, David French in the New York Times argued that this phrase in Article 2, the executive power of the United States shall be vested in the President of the United States, was a major error on behalf of the framers. So I'm out wondering if you could explain, and if in any way you differ from what Mike and Chris have said, in the sense that, the phrase, the language is only to clarify that we're not going to have a plural versus a single there, but how in combination with Article 2, Section 3, the take care clause. If you do these two clauses together, there is a reasoned, rational explanation and justification for the unitary theory of the executive. Would you agree with that?
I do. However, I think French is wrong. I don't think it's the text itself. I think he's relying a lot on how it's been interpreted and how our history has evolved. I don't know. So I would take issue with his. I think it's an overstatement. Maybe I'll be generous and put it that way rather than just simply being wrong. I think, at the convention, as Mike has already alluded to, there's a lot of discussion about how to sort this out. I mean, Randolph starts out really quickly like a single executive is the fetus of tyranny or a fetus of monarchy. Gary wanted an executive council. They were all over the place. I mean, Rutledge wanted to limit it to prohibiting executive power on war and peace. I don't know exactly what he was referring there, but they were all over the map. They weren't excited about how Holland operated and with its executive. They had kind of a council creating an executive in Holland. So I do think at the convention they're really repudiating the articles where the Committee of States was the kind of executive. So they're repudiating the articles. They're also repudiating the Continental Congress, how it operated during the Revolution, through several people doing executive functions, Jay and Robert Morris, most notably. So I think But they're also interested in energy and dispatch. That comes up on a lot of the speeches. Gouverneur Morris had a couple of fairly lengthy speeches about energy and dispatch is necessary. And I think to claim Hamilton as kind of ground zero on the unitary executive is reasonable. His June, I think a June 18th speech, holy cow, where he lays out his vision for an executive, pretty powerful. Um, but I think French is basing his argument, and I think Helvidius Pacificus is kind of the first go around of interpretation of the vesting clause, and it had to do with Washington's policy regarding the proclamation of neutrality. So, in 93 is when in my view, is when they really start to talk about the meaning of that first phrase in Article 2. So it's not the text itself. I think ground zero is the interpretation starting with Pacificus and Helvidius debates, and Hamilton being Pacificus and Madison being um, Helvidius. But I think it is reasonable to assume a unitary executive. Now, I think all bets are off when you talk about the explosion of agencies in the 20th century. I mean, it's a different world post 1935. But I do think the unitary executive theory, depending on how you define unitary, is there. But I think French is relying on an interpretation and evolution more so than the moment in when they created the Constitution.
Well, would you agree that it has become the dominant constitutional theory and accepted not only by those
Um,
supporters of the presidency, but Congress itself? Because Congress keeps passing laws that
yeah,
increase, one might argue, executive independence from Congress and executive power. Going from 1798 with
sure,
the Alien Enemies Act to 1977 and the International Emergency Powers Act, Congress
right.
seems to be, reinforcing this notion of an all-powerful executive that can act
Well, and
unilaterally.
they also keep creating agencies that are executive agencies that give, by de facto, in my view, give the executive oversight and control of those agencies. And there's been court interpretations on the legitimate to what extent those are independent of Congress once they've been created. And Chris may need to weigh in on that because he's more familiar with all the cases related to that. But that's why I say post 35 and New Deal, it's a whole new world where the meaning of unitary executive is, I think, by nature different than how we're defining unitary executive prior to New Deal.
Well, can we play around with that for a second, gentlemen? I'm curious, Tim, what is your definition of unitary executive? And I'd like all three of you to chime
Yeah.
in briefly and maybe help the students. Maybe there's a spectrum here of this understanding of unitary executive.
Well, the spectrum
My
is
view
driven
is
by where,
it's
yeah.
independent and they pretty much the president can do whatever they want as this current
Well,
president has said.
stop. Then we're throwing out check and balance out altogether. Another, I think, relevant constitutional principle here. But pre 35, I would tend to see, with the exception of, well, I take Lincoln off the table because it's wartime, but Teddy Roosevelt, really remarkable, powerful executive. His stewardship of theory of the presidency, remarkably powerful. But before 35, I would tend to see unitary executive and define it as a single person, the original issues at the convention, not a plural. Uh, and there's also an interesting thing that occurs in Hamilton's writing on the presidency back in the day. Accountability is better if you have a single. If you have a committee, you can you can cover cover your backside because it's a committee and there are other people to blame. So it seems counter to the way we think today that a single executive is more accountable. A unitary is more accountable. And then the argument, the impeachment kicks in and whatever. So I think the accountability thing is also interesting when they're talking about a single person presidency. So that's how I would define it pre 35.
Professor Williams? How do you, I'm sorry, you were in the
Yeah, no,
middle
that's
of.
fine. Look, I think there's at least two different strands of this. I think there's one who says unitary executive theory means that the president is in charge of the executive branch. He's the boss of the executive branch. And so that means with these agencies that Tim's talking about, he should have the ability to hire and fire at will no matter what Congress has said. And I think if I'm following Tim's argument, I think I'm persuaded by going somewhat there. But I think that some would say it just means that the executive branch can do whatever they want within our system of government. Like that, even if Congress says I'm going to allocate money to this, the president can say, no, I'm not going to spend it on that. And I think by just looking at Article 2 without looking at the context of the Constitution, of setting up this system of separated institutions sharing powers, I think you're missing the bigger point. And I think that there needs to be some acknowledgement that Congress does have a role to play here. And whereas the president maybe should have the ability to choose certain leaders, I don't think that I'm not with the argument that the president can dismantle agencies that have been created by Congress, or that Congress doesn't have the power to create those agencies that come with under its Section 8 powers. So I think that argument goes too extreme for me.
I think
Professor,
it's interesting to note that the first argument about executive power in Congress and when they first convened was removal. To Mike's point, they spent a lot of time on can he fire? I mean, Senate's involved in hiring, approving appointments. Do they have to be involved in removing? And so that kind of dabbles on the edge of do the unitary theory. And the argument was, yeah, he can remove. That
Even
was called the
Madison,
bargain of '89, I
yeah,
think.
even Madison came around on that.
Yeah. Yep.
Back to what you said in terms of accountability, because if we're going to hold the president accountable for
Yep.
what happens within his administration, then he should be able to remove those people as an administration. I kind of recoiled though when Mike said the thought process that some people seem to have is that the president can do what he wants regardless of what Congress has said. But when Congress passes legislation to create independent agencies to try and insulate people, like say the Federal Reserve Board, to try and make sure things don't get too
Yeah.
politicized. Yeah, I'm going back to the case that Dave started our program with before, and that is Youngstown Sheet and Tube, and I think Company versus Sawyer. And I can't help but think of Justice Jackson's three tiers of presidential power. So the president's power is highest when Congress and the Constitution has spoken, right? Its lowest is when the Congress and the Constitution has spoken and denied that power. And then you get in that zone of twilight when both Congress and the Constitution has been silent. So when Congress has spoken, the president should be limited, right? Because they pass statute. So if we're going to say that the president has the authority to defy statutory law at will, I think there is a very slippery slope. I think I hearken back to President George H.W. Bush asking for a resolution in the first Gulf War, but privately saying, I don't need some old goat in Congress to be able to tell me I can do this, which speaks to my opening in terms of, can the president just blow up ships at sea when we normally wouldn't do that in normal drug interdiction? So it's a slippery slope, and this whole idea of a unitary executive is I flinch at it because I go back to the origins, as Tim alluded to. They're talking about one person versus a committee versus a triumvirate, and they lay out all the reasons for this. And yes, that means you do have it as executive. You do have authority over the executive branch, but Congress has so much power over that executive branch. As Tim alluded to, the Pacifica Salvidius debate, some part of that is a power to create, is a power to unmake, right? The power to make also includes the power to unmake. And what role does the Congress play in this versus the president? So and again, it is a modern theory put forth by modern people to try and grow executive power. And it's happened, we get legislation that you mentioned, Dave, all the way back to 1798 or 1977, because Congress is willing to give up that power to the executive.
but wouldn't you, I mean, I understand your point, but it seems to me that it's especially in the field of foreign policy, that this country wholeheartedly accepts from the average citizen to Congress and the court that in the field of foreign policy, the president has absolute authority. And in fact, again, if we look
No,
at Theodore Roosevelt, he sends the
no.
ships around the globe and Congress, and says, what are you going to do about it? All
Yeah,
right.
if you want
And
back,
now
hey,
we accept,
yeah,
and there's not going to be a single ounce of pushback on the murder of 11 Venezuelans because the president said they they are a threat to our national security.
how do we
And as
know they're
long as the
Venezuelans? How do
president
we know they're
says that,
Venezuelans? How do we know they're Venezuelans?
hmm,
How do we know they're Venezuelans?
well,
How
that's
do you know
another
they
good
weren't?
question. That's a good question. I'm just going from CNN, I guess.
Well, but here's the other thing, because most cocaine is not going to be delivered in cigarette boats. Most cocaine is going to come into this country from Colombia, not Venezuela. Most cocaine
Well,
is going to come in by plane. What they
I
deliver
under,
to
I
this country,
understand it's the minutia here, Chris, but the point is you're not going to get any pushback because as a political and constitutional culture, we accept the unitary power of the president in foreign policy.
We haven't always, David, you're
We
right.
haven't always. I agree.
Okay,
I
but
would say it emerges with Teddy Roosevelt and
yes,
then evolves.
but I think that these things are somewhat dictated by the norms and the cultures of what people get used to. I mean, there was a time when it was like we have to expect the system to work where the different institutions are going to fight for their authority. So, David, you're absolutely right. As soon as Congress starts giving that up, then there's no debate to be had. But there was a time in the 19th century where Congress declared wars and then told the president he could be the commander in chief, right? And once it's like a slippery slope. Once Congress starts giving up that power, and then once, all of a sudden now, this idea that I mean, I remember I was taught in graduate school about presidential power. Okay, there's a difference between the president when he's exercising foreign policy versus domestic policy. And of course, we've given him everything with foreign policy, but that doesn't mean domestic policy. And what we're seeing now, not just with President Trump, it's been with previous presidents because Congress is not doing things. Presidents have been more likely to act in the domestic sphere using executive orders and other things. And now I think as a culture, we're kind of just getting used to it, right? And we want government to do things. And it seems like the only way things get done is when the president is acting on his own, right? And so I think you're right, we've created that, but that is not the way it always was. And
Yeah.
political attitudes can change as well. They could change in a different direction, I guess.
that's my point. And it is we have a Congress that's MIA. We've had a Congress over the length of our existence that has been willing to give up to cede that power. And I always ask students, has it been an abdication or a usurpation
Right.
power? And I think it's both. And David, I want to go back to a case called Curtis Wright, uh, where Justice Sutherland comes up with this idea of the sole organ doctrine, right? And the sole organ doctrine dealing with the president and foreign policy, he's the sole organ of foreign policy. And he quotes some congressman from Virginia, a young congressman giving a speech. I think his name was John Marshall. And John Marshall's the one that came up with it. He actually coined that term in his speech in Congress about the sole organ. But Sutherland, in a really considered to be not a very good opinion, in quoting John Marshall, doesn't do the entire quote because John Marshall says the president gets to be the sole organ after Congress has spoken, after Congress has taken action. Then the president gets to have executive power and carry out that action as dictated by Congress. But Sutherland doesn't put that in his opinion in the 1930s in the Curtis Wright decision. So that whole idea of that sole organ, and you're right, David, most Americans come to believe that they think the president has the power to declare war, which flies in the face of what the framers intended. Right? It's not but it's what we have now. But we've allowed it to get that way, and I lay the blame at Congress, honestly, and the courts to a degree.
Well, and let's focus because you talked about Youngstown, and it is considered an iconic decision when it comes to limiting the executive power and kind of a formula, if you want to use that, of how that works out. But just 8 years earlier, with most members being the same in Korematsu, all right, this court, I think it was 7-2, pretty much said we are not going to question the president. All
That's
right.
not what they said.
Yeah, it is.
No, it's not.
Okay, go ahead and enlighten me.
Justice Black said in this situation, we absolutely have to take a look at this. It's imperative that we examine this. It's not that the president, it's not that we can't question the president, right? He absolutely says that they have to look at it. If you read his opinion, right? Just in Justice Black's opinion, that he said we have to look at what the president does. He stated that while restrictions on a single racial group are suspect and subject to scrutiny, pressing public necessity, right, may sometimes justify the existence of such restrictions. But he says prior to that, we absolutely have to take a look at, and the court has the authority to weigh in on this. So it's not like the president's action for Executive Order 9066, the internment of Japanese American citizens in camps, it was unquestioned. It was absolutely, as Justice Black said, the ability of the courts to question it.
So you see no distinction between the two cases, no inconsistency.
I think there are different contexts. Honestly, one, you have we were attacked by the Japanese Imperial Navy and Air Force, on on December 7th, 1941. So we're at war, and people are afraid. And so but even then, even in wartime, right? Even in wartime, the court said we still have to look at this. And the trouble is with Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. Then we were in a UN action. It was the Congress was not as Congress was kind of hemming and hawing on the steel strike. So the context of the two cases are a little bit different, right? Because most people in the 1950s probably couldn't pick Korea out on a map.
So, Professor Moore, you actually planted the seed in my head about comparing these two cases. I'm just curious about your thoughts.
Well, I don't have any on that, but I read, shockingly, I read the full everybody's opinion in Youngstown, and I was quite struck with Black's. There was a sentence in his opinion where he's speculating and maybe bemoaning what he called the expansion of the theater of war. Now, I can't help but think that that's maybe his way of justifying Korematsu and wondering what, because I mean, obviously, in the executive order in 9066, it's almost like the West Coast was defined as a theater of war, and therefore the Secretary of War had the authority to declare the West Coast as such and implement this policy. So I just was struck by Black's nervousness with in later on in Youngstown with his seemingly nervousness about the expansion of the theater of war. And I think that's remarkable given the fact that we're on a war on terror and how we have all these new and very various and creative ways of defining emergencies and defining theaters of war, which supposedly justify executive action. So that sentence for me, in Black's opinion in Youngstown, really stood out to me.
But the thing is, though, Korematsu allowed the infringement of civil liberties of a racial minority for perceived national security. Youngstown was about affirming property rights and the principle that the president cannot unilaterally infringe on such rights, and especially where Congress has legislated. So when Congress has legislated in the Taft-Hartley Act, it's clear. And this other one, and the court said, and Black says this in Korematsu, we absolutely have to take a look at this. And so they could have decided the other way. And if you read Justice Robert Jackson's, and I think Murphy's dissent in Korematsu, they're very powerful. Oh my gosh. They're not going, and basically, I'm paraphrasing, they're not going to put racism in the Constitution.
So, Professor Moore, let's move to the next topic. It seems to me that the United States is more often than not governed in the modern era by executive order. Most people, including students that I have and people I interact with in the community, seem to be okay with this. Could you provide an explanation of the source and legitimate use of executive orders, if any, exist out there?
Well, sure. I would say the source is in the Constitution, where the Constitution says he can have cabinet. members, advisors. Now, what that automatically means is the boss is going to have to tell his employees how to do stuff. And Washington does that. I think he's the first one to have an executive order, and it's kind of bland compared to a lot of the executive orders we have now, because it was essentially, hey guys, you work for me, and occasionally you got to show up and tell me what you're doing so I can, either confirm or steer you in a different direction. So I think the Constitution sets up in the white space of the Constitution executive orders because it allows for advisors. Um, so I mean that's an interpretation of the white space. I'll freely acknowledge that, but I think that alone is maybe a textual basis. It's interesting to me that most executive orders in our history have been generated from the agencies themselves seeking clarification. So many of them are, okay, you've talked to me, this is the president speaking, you've talked to me and I'm going to give you some directives as to how I want you to operate because you've asked. So in some ways, it's come to the executive rather than more often than not than the executive going to the agencies. Now, we're in one of those moments where that's changed. And I think to Mike's point, the cultural context of that matters. Um, so I also think there's a white space constitutional interpretation argument in the take care clause. That's a part of the presidential responsibility to take care to see the laws are faithfully executed. Well, it's only a half step to, therefore, I'm going to write an executive order how to do it. So, but again, I think there's a lot of interpretation that goes into the creation of advisors and the take care clause that get us to this phenomenon called executive orders.
Well, who is the president ordering, or who can the president order, and who can't the president order?
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Really? How much time do we have? I mean,
Well,
that's the
try to
crux
make
of the
it.
matter. I mean, much of this boils down to agency, executive agencies, independent agencies. That's where the courts really have tried to, it's a thorny wicket to sort through which agencies are legitimately to be ordered around and which are not.
So, okay. President Trump has issued, let's see, I have it here, 198 executive orders. Uh, does, and many of those include activities within states. Does the president have the authority to order activity or to create executive policy in state government,
Well,
state
it depends.
policy?
It depends who specifically he's ordering. I mean, I was shocked, and I'll defer to Chris and Mike on that because that's a legal question, and I'm way over my skis on that. Well, the thing that amazed me was Trump's first. I did this 100-day check, like who leads and who's the best batting average on the first 100 days executive orders. And I mean, FDR, I think they got the numbers here. Biden, his first 100 days, he had 42. Uh, Trump, 143 in the first 100 day. FDR, 99 in the first 100 days. So everybody's that first 100 days is pretty busy in terms of executive orders. But who in the states? I guess my half half-assed guess would be it depends what entities he's ordering to do something, whether it's legitimate or not.
Prosecuting burning of the American flag? Is that the jurisdiction of the president to order?
No, that's a stupid. I'm sorry. No, that should be an easy one.
To make federal architecture beautiful again?
Well, I don't know. Do states have garbage collection? I don't.
I just
I
again,
mean,
these are
a lot of this. I mean, to me, a lot of this is performative.
okay. Chris, he's deferred to you. It's anything that you want to add to
Uh,
what Tim has said?
David, tell me about that golf game again.
It was by executive order.
Yeah, by executive order that Dave Richmond will shoot a 75 today.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with Tim. It's performance based, and I think we're gonna throw as much stuff against the wall, and we're gonna see what sticks, and we're gonna see who pushes back. because we know Congress won't. We know Congress won't do anything. I mean, I'm sorry for students and teachers watching this to keep ripping on Congress, but I'm not even sure that we have one right now. But I think you continue to throw all at it. I was aghast at the number you shared, David. I knew it was high, but I did not know it was that high.
Yeah.
And so I think we're just going to throw as much stuff against the wall and see who pushes back, and that kind of thing. We're going to expand the power as much as we can.
But if we go back to what Mike said in the first question, if this becomes a norm in our constitutional political culture, and all the people see is he's doing this, and as you said, not getting any pushback, all right, doesn't that now become the norm that the president can govern like this?
Yeah. And especially if you have immunity for your official presidential actions.
Yeah.
So when you've been given that get out of jail free card by the court, by the Roberts court, in an opinion that really is not tied to text or history, which they allegedly like, that certainly gives them a nice little monopoly get out of jail free card.
I mean, I do agree, students. I think you should, look at the debates at the founding about the executive needing energy. I think it was Hamilton, right? The energy. We're experiencing an executive with a lot of energy, and while I do think a lot of this is performative, I'm becoming more inclined to think it's not just all performative. That it is set up to where they don't. If they throw 100 things at the wall, if they get 3 through, that really radically changes the nature of the game. I mean, this ruling that came down in the court about the lack of nationwide injunctions is going to be, I mean, a bunch of presidents have wanted that. We've talked about that. That's going to, for the next 3 years and for the next president, that's a game changer, right? So I do think there's a political strategy here, because the Supreme Court is basically told the district courts that Supreme Court's gonna be the only one that can decide things, and I think that Trump rightly sees the Supreme Court as an ally, or not an ally, but as an institution that will side with him more often than not. So I do think that it's not all just performative.
Statistically, the court has definitely come down on President Trump's side, especially on the shadow docket, which I think the students definitely need to be paying attention to the shadow docket, because as David alluded to in a previous program, constantly declaring emergencies. We've got an emergency for this, an emergency for that, an emergency for this. So therefore, it necessitates executive action, right? And then we have a lower court putting the squahilis on that, and then you get immediately appealing to the Supreme Court for an emergency ruling, so it ends up on the shadow docket without actually hearing the merits of the case. Right? We're not going to decide whether or not the executive order taking away birthright citizenship is constitutional. We're going to make the ruling that these lower courts can't issue nationwide injunctions, therefore expanding power.
So on top of his orders, there's a new issue that's come up that I wasn't real familiar with. So, I had to go do some studying, and that is, modern presidents, including the current occupant, believe that through the take care clause, that the executive has unilateral authority to rescind budget expenditures, or what is commonly called a pocket rescission. How do you respond to that argument based upon your study of both the documents through ratification and decades of teaching the Constitution? That's to you, Chris.
Oh, about the rescission?
Yeah.
Well, the pocket rescission is an interesting thing. It's a little different than the rescission law. Pocket rescission is similar to the pocket veto, students, which I think many of you guys will be familiar with. In the pocket veto, just a quick review. If the Congress dumps a lot of stuff on the, let's say Congress actually did something, but they tended to procrastinate, like students, teachers, and everybody else. And they dump a lot of stuff on the president's desk, but the Congress is going to be out of session in about 10 days, then the president can hold on to it and it becomes a veto, and he doesn't have to give the reasons why. Thus the term put in your pocket, wait for Congress to go on break, and it's a pocket veto. And the rescission is still the same thing, but the length of time is 45 days for when Congress is going to be in session. And I was not really, honestly, I was not really familiar with the pocket rescission So I had to look this up, and boy, it's not constitutional. I mean, everything that I've seen is it just tells me that it's not legal. And we go back to the Budget Impoundment Act of the 1970s when President Nixon tried to hold on to money that Congress had already appropriated. And the court said you can't do that. And then Congress passes the Budget Impoundment Act that prevents the president. So again, back to Congress has spoken. We have a statute. Congress, if Congress approves this money, then part of that take care clause is that the president has to use this money for these programs to do what Congress had asked them to do it. So the idea is if I withhold this and Congress is going to be out of session within 45 days, then it becomes a pocket rescission. But everything that I've seen, and again, this was new to me, that is not constitutional. It's not legal. So, and again, we see this playing out through the food chain of courts, which will eventually, of course, work its way up to the Supreme Court. So,
so rescission can happen, but it ultimately has to, because didn't Congress just rescind some funds? Wasn't it for NPR and
yes.
stuff?
Yes. So, but again, you're getting congressional approval, right? Congress is saying, "Oh yeah, so you don't want to fund Big Bird? Okay, that's fine." So, but
and I should have written it down. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Chris. Go ahead.
No, you're right, David. So Congress, but again, you're going to Congress to say, "Okay, we're going to pull these funds back." So we've approved these funds. It's on the table, but we're going to pull these back. So we're going to agree with the president on this. But the pocket rescission is Congress is not going to have a chance to put out an opinion because they're not going to be in session.
Right.
Therefore, that's my sources, what I found, like the Government Accounting Office, GOA.
Right, and I guess I'm just wondering. I should have written this down because he has said, all right, recently after the public radio and that, but he has said he can unilaterally rescind funds. And I'm trying to remember what it was, what the topic or policy or group was. Does anybody have an idea of in the last couple of weeks? And again, I should have remembered. I came across it and forgot there. So it seems like it's a no-brainer. All right, given our policy of or our system of separation of powers, that the president couldn't do this unilaterally. But the kids are asked to deal with this. So go ahead.
Let me. This is I've got this here now. A pocket rescission is a tactic in which a president attempts to cancel congressionally appropriated funds by taking advantage of the procedural rules set by the Impoundment Control Act. Under the ICA, a president can request that Congress rescind certain funds, and Congress then has 45 days to consider the request. A pocket rescission occurs when a president submits a rescission request so late in the fiscal year that Congress cannot act on it before the funds legally expire. That money then goes unspent without congressional approval. And according again to the Government Accounting Office, the take care clause does not enable the president to use pocket rescissions.
Right. So, and again, since this is happening, it'll be curious what the court, decides about this. Since
it's very similar to a case called Clinton versus City of New York, where the Supreme Court said the line item veto is unconstitutional. Some governors have the line item veto to single out certain parts of a bill that they don't want, but the court argued in that case, or the court ruled in that case, that it violates the separation of powers doctrine, because in essence, if you give the president the line item veto, he has lawmaking ability. So they ruled, they struck down the line item veto for the president, which, by the way, every president would love to have. Every president would love to have that power of the line item veto.
So, Professor Williams, let's kind of go back to the beginning, because at core of Project 2025, that was, a hot topic during the campaign, and yes, that's right. Professor Moore actually read the entire, 900 pages of Project 2025. At the very core of that is the unitary executive principle that the president can do these things unilaterally. And I'm wondering that you are a comparativist. That's your focus as a political scientist. You do comparative politics, international relations, and such. Is the trend, I guess, around the world? Is this a trend around the world that more and more executives are attempting and being successful in taking unilateral power away from their other representative branches or courts. In regards to the U.S., do you see this development as a greater threat to domestic or foreign affairs of the American people? So there are two questions there. I hope you got them. If not, ask for help.
Well, the term unitary theory of the executive is not something you'll read about in other countries. So that particular justification is something that is unique to the United States. And I think it's interesting for the students to maybe think about that in terms of our constitutional history, why it is that to make this argument, we're coming up with a theory that's going back to the debates of the 1780s or before, like, it just kind of tells you a lot about who we are as a people. In the last,
Is that a good thing or a bad thing, Michael?
this
Makes us British, doesn't it? It makes us British,
I
doesn't it?
mean, I should have said this the very first question. I do think that we have a complicated political culture. This is, I think, what David was getting on the first question. The way we treat George Washington during his presidency and after he passes away, it is like the monarchy window dressing. So I do think that there is that streak in our political culture that is very much attracted to that. So yeah. Over the last 20 years, there has been more and more governmental systems where we've seen the centralization of power in the executive, whether that's in prime minister systems or in presidential systems. So yes, we have seen that happen. It's been one of the major reasons why we've seen the percentage of people living under a democracy go from 46% to 20%. In political scientists, and we'll put this in the show notes, there was a big debate in the 1990s when Eastern European countries and African countries and Asian countries were writing new constitutions about what's the best system of government in terms of not having executive power be too much. And most political scientists came down on the side of pick a parliamentary system. Presidential systems, because it's winner take all, because you can get the Andrew Jacksons who will say, I'm the only person that everyone's voted for. They're more inclined to take power. And that's what we've kind of seen. Most of our presidential systems exist in South America. They exist there because they copied the US Constitution more so than other places. But you see it in Hungary, you saw it in Poland, you saw it in parliamentary systems as well. So maybe the next question is, okay, so why? What's happened in the last 20 years? And but we've talked about this. I really believe it comes down to a combination of people living in democracies or semi-democracies want problems being solved. And when problems don't get solved, they're looking to single leaders or single parties to help them do that. So yes, there has been that. It's not justified as unitary theory. It's justified in maybe just let's get some stuff done, right? Whether it's a bigger threat, I think we've had experience living under a unitary theory of the executive with foreign policy. I mean, I think we've been living that for most of the 20th century. Maybe not back to 1935, but definitely from World War II on. So I get that threat. Maybe I'm just used to that threat and I'm used to that ebb and flow. So I think where this can go in a way that's going to feel more uncomfortable, like it's going to feel like something new, is when this starts getting applied to the domestic scene. I think that's why a lot of us, are feeling funny about this right now, right? I mean, where I'm sitting in higher ed, it feels like, oh my gosh, I haven't ever thought about what the president thinks about USD in a long time. If you're at a law firm, you're thinking about what the president's thinking. If you're in a city that's a sanctuary city, you're thinking about what the president thinks about you. That's a different political sort of environment than we found ourselves in the 20th century, I think.
All right. Yes, Chris.
I'm sorry. This is a question for Michael.
Yeah.
Based on your answer, do you think this trend in the world is in relation to other nations? Because I have Hobbes. Dave starts us off with Hobbes, and I'm back to Hobbes. That we are worried about these other nations that are becoming more autocratic and more powerful. So for our own self-preservation, we want to have our own autocrat in power so that he can move quickly because we're worried about these other nations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, I can speak for Africa as a continent because I know that the best. I would say no, it doesn't have to do with interstate sort of things.
Okay.
I think it has to do, I mean, 25 years ago, I used to try to blow my students' minds with these surveys. I'd say, look at the support of democracy in this country. 80, 90% people support democracy. How many people are satisfied with their democracy? And it'd be like 30, 40%. And it was always in Africa, we could talk about it, then Asia, South America. Slowly, I started showing my students, well, this is happening in Western Europe. This is happening in North America. I think we are right now living in a reality where I didn't call this, political scientists call these dissatisfied Democrats, right? So I think that there's a certain flow to this. Like, where do dissatisfied Democrats go when they maybe support, but they're not seeing things get resolved, or seeing things get resolved in a way they don't like? They feel disempowered, whether that's legit or not. And I think that there's just a lot of people living in the world in places with very high income levels. So we're not talking about places that are really like low income who are feeling this way. I think it has to do with globalization. People looking at China and saying, well, China's doing okay with a strong state model. Like, why do we need democracy and capitalism? We could develop using the China model, right? So I think there's all that stuff going on there as well.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time together to talk about the executive branch. And so now we want to provide final thoughts and recommendations to students and teachers. So, Professor Moore.
Yeah, Chris mentioned the Reagan era on reference the Reagan era in executive power and the emergence of unitary executive theory. I would urge students, I think it was Dick Cheney who wrote a minority report after the Iran-Contra investigations. And I would really recommend students, like if you really want to get a handle on the modern ground zero of this view, look at Cheney, because I think he was the primary author, if I'm not mistaken. And you got to be impressed that I know that, guys.
That's from the cheap seats, baby. That's deep.
Yeah, I mean, for a guy who's stuck pre-1800s, I'm kind of impressed with myself. But look at Dick Cheney's report, because he's not happy with the special counsel's investigation into the activities of Reagan and the Iran-Contra. So look at the minority report authored by Dick Cheney for Ground Zero in the modern sense.
Professor Kavanaugh.
First, I want to apologize to students and teachers. I get a little worked up on this stuff, so I get so frustrated because it's. I mean, I think I'm going to steal a term from Dr. David Adler. We all have to be what he calls Madisonian monitors, right? We have to understand if we're going to rely on the Constitution, what does it say, what was intended, and how have we used it? And so I get worked up because I get so frustrated with a Congress that's MIA, missing in action, right? So I apologize for getting worked up on that because it doesn't have to be that way, but it's that way. As David alluded to, that's what people think, and he's right. That's where we are. I would encourage you to check out a book by presidential power historian Theodore Lowy, and it's called LOWI is how you spell his last name. It's called The Personal President, Power Invested, Promise Unfulfilled. And he makes an analogy to the president of the United States as the Wizard of Oz. And one, that, you know, if you're familiar with the story, everybody expects the president to have something in that black bag for them to solve their problems, right? And the idea that's the politics of expectation, the idea of the illusion of power, right? So I'm all powerful and I can, you know, no one is seeing him and all that kind of stuff. But there's also the man behind the curtain. And when that man behind the curtain is revealed, it really is back to that illusion of power. And also the empty promises of a policy without law. It's one of the things that he addresses in there. So again, I would check that. I would see if you could find that. It's 1985 text. Obviously, Professor Lowy is really a source to take a look at. But you can't have any discussion, and I'm saying this, you cannot have any discussion about executive power without including the other two branches. So as you develop your arguments and you talk about these questions, which are tough questions, and Dave had great questions for us tonight, you have to include the other two branches, right? You just have to. That's it.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I just want to build off that. Students, my reading of history is pretty clear that the consensus at the founding was that government was created to prevent tyranny and to promote liberty. Tyranny is when there is too much power in one person or one branch. And that the founders thought they'd come up with a system that could handle that. Just because they thought that, that's what we were one of the reasons we were founded, doesn't mean that's the way it's always going to be. I mean, Thomas Jefferson said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And I was thinking about that idea of vigilance, and I was thinking about another concept I was reading about this week. And I think it flows from this dissatisfied Democrats thing I was pointing out. I think that's led to, there was this poll that came out that I'll put in the show notes. About 42% of folks in Western democracies are ambivalent. If they're asked, do you support democracy? A minority will say, yeah. Do you support not democracy? A very small would say no. Well, would it be okay to have a not too democratic person if they got things done? That's the ambivalence part. So I would encourage you, like, this is really a tension between vigilance and ambivalence. And I would encourage you to not be ambivalent, to take a stand on whichever stand you want to take in terms of how you feel about what's going on, and to be vigilant. Because I do think things are always capable of swinging, as Chris likes to say, it's a pendulum. And but I think it's up to us as a society to sort of say, where's the line in the stand where we say, okay, this is not consistent with who we are as a country.
And to echo my colleagues, throughout this program a few times, and again, we have for the 5 years been together, we do not hesitate to point the finger at Congress. And there's plenty of reason to do so. But I was reminded by reading Federalist 51 that a dependence on the people, no doubt, is the primary control on the government. And as Mike just said, the sheer lack of the number of people who seem to be concerned is bothersome. And so I wouldn't hesitate to blame the people, because I see our government as a reactive form of government. It's representative, and so it reacts to the people. And if the people aren't vigilant, as just brought up, then the Congress is going to do whatever it's going to do to preserve themselves. And that's, to me, they need to be afraid of the people. And they're not afraid of the people right now. At least the majority is not afraid. All right. They're afraid of the man in the Oval Office, but they're not afraid of the American people. So don't hesitate maybe to point the finger at ourselves sometimes. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation. In our next session, we're going to be going to another favorite subject and our favorite F word, and that is federalism. And so until then, peace, love, yoga, tacos. Bye-bye. Bye-byes.